So you need to extend your Wi-Fi signal, but you're not totally sure how to do it. Honestly, this is pretty understandable. There are so many different terms and devices that are used to extend your Wi-Fi signal that honestly, it can get really confusing. I've previously compared Wi-Fi extenders and mesh Wi-Fi. Today we're going to be running through another comparison. We're going to be comparing Wi-Fi extenders and wireless access points. So let's get into the differences between these two devices and when you might want to implement each one. At a high level, both Wi-Fi extenders and wireless access points, they do exactly the same thing. They're meant to extend the Wi-Fi signal in your home to areas that don't have a strong Wi-Fi signal. The key distinction here, however, is how these devices go about extending your Wi-Fi signal. When it comes to Wi-Fi extenders, most of the time they extend your Wi-Fi signal wirelessly. You might note how I said most of the time there, and that's because there's a little bit of a catch when it comes to these devices, and we'll get into that shortly. To illustrate how Wi-Fi extenders are implemented, here we have a standard home network. You have your modem, which provides your home with a connection to the internet. You have a router that's connected to your modem, and this router is broadcasting a Wi-Fi signal. And let's say you want to implement a Wi-Fi extender. Basically what that looks like is your router will communicate with your Wi-Fi extender wirelessly over Wi-Fi, and then your Wi-Fi extender will rebroadcast the Wi-Fi signal that it's receiving from your router. Another important aspect about Wi-Fi extenders is because they are taking your router's Wi-Fi signal and rebroadcasting it, that means they need to be implemented somewhere within the range of your router's Wi-Fi signal. So here's another diagram, and this green shaded area represents the Wi-Fi signal that your router is broadcasting. And it just means that if you have a Wi-Fi extender, it needs to be implemented somewhere in this area. So if you wanted to provide Wi-Fi coverage to this dead zone, what you would do, you implement a Wi-Fi extender, which is within that Wi-Fi range of your router. Your extender takes that Wi-Fi signal from your router and then rebroadcasts it to cover the dead zone in your home. With wireless access points, they extend the Wi-Fi coverage in your home with a wired connection. So what that looks like, we have our standard home network. You implement a wireless access point. It's connected to your router with an Ethernet cable. And then this wireless access point is essentially serving as another router in your home. Unlike a Wi-Fi extender, it's not leveraging the existing Wi-Fi network that your router is broadcasting. It works independently and broadcasts its own Wi-Fi network. So what this allows you to do, because your Wi-Fi access point connects to your router with an Ethernet cable and it doesn't leverage your router's Wi-Fi signal, is you can implement these Wi-Fi access points anywhere that you need to extend a Wi-Fi signal, and it doesn't need to be within this Wi-Fi range of your router. So here, if we're implementing a Wi-Fi access point, as you can see, these Wi-Fi signals are not overlapping. The access point is connected to your router with an Ethernet cable, and your access point is providing Wi-Fi coverage to that area that you want to cover. So in talking about the differences between Wi-Fi extenders and wireless access points, we've already highlighted a few. The first is that Wi-Fi extenders, they work wirelessly and they extend your Wi-Fi signal wirelessly. Access points need a wired connection to your router in order to broadcast the Wi-Fi signal. On top of that, another key difference is that Wi-Fi extenders, because they're taking your router's Wi-Fi signal and rebroadcasting another Wi-Fi signal, your extender will have a different Wi-Fi network name and password. What this means is if you're moving devices throughout your home, you will need to manually reconnect these devices to either your Wi-Fi extender or your router, depending upon the device that they're closer to. When it comes to wireless access points, you don't have this same problem because your Wi-Fi access point is going to broadcast the same Wi-Fi network name and password that your router is. That's basically what I mean when I say your access point serves as another router in your home. They're both broadcasting the same Wi-Fi network names and passwords. So when you're moving throughout your home, your devices will automatically connect to either your access point or your router. This isn't something you have to do manually, which makes things a lot easier. Another important difference between these two devices is in their performance. Because your Wi-Fi extender is receiving your Wi-Fi signal from your router, taking it and then rebroadcasting it out to different areas of your home, What this does is it implements essentially another hop in communications. So if you have a device connected to your extender that wants to access the internet, your device will send that request to your extender. Your extender will take that request, send it to your router, and then your router will send it to the internet, and then the reverse happens in the other direction. This slows things down, and as a result of this, when you're connecting to a Wi-Fi extender, you won't be getting the same bandwidth that you'll be getting if you were connecting to your router. Many times you'll see limited performance, sometimes half as fast as what you would get if your devices were connected to your router. On the other hand, because Wi-Fi access points are broadcasting their own Wi-Fi signal and they're not leveraging the existing Wi-Fi signal from your router, they don't have these same performance limitations. When connecting to Wi-Fi access points, you get the same performance as if you were connecting to the router in your home. Another key distinction between these two devices is the fact that Wi-Fi extenders need to be connected to a power outlet. They're connected directly to an outlet, so you need to implement them, obviously, in a location where you have a power outlet already in place. With Wi-Fi access points, you don't have this same limitation, and that's because you can implement a technology called Power over Ethernet to power these devices. In short, Power over Ethernet allows you to provide power to your wireless access point using an Ethernet cable, and this allows you to implement your wireless access points in locations that aren't close to power outlets. This gives you ultimate freedom when it comes to extending your Wi-Fi signal because you can place your Wi-Fi access point in a location that best serves your home, and you're not limited to implementing it in a location where you already have a power outlet. At this point, do you feel like you have a good understanding of the differences between Wi-Fi extenders and Wi-Fi access points? If so, it's the perfect time for a plot twist. As you'll recall, I earlier said that Wi-Fi extenders most of the time extend your Wi-Fi signal wirelessly. The reason I said this is because newer Wi-Fi extenders, now they have the ability to put them into access point mode, which allows them to connect to your router with an Ethernet cable, and then in doing so, you don't have the same performance limitations that you do when the device is in extender mode. This flips everything on its head because if you have the ability to connect your extender and router with an Ethernet cable, you can essentially just use it as an access point. On top of that, if your Wi-Fi extender and your router are made by the same manufacturer, for example, I have a TP-Link router and I have an AX3000 TP-Link extender, and both of these devices support what's called mesh mode. Essentially what this does is it allows you to use your extender in mesh mode so it can communicate with your router wirelessly, and you still don't have those same performance limitations that you would have if it was in extender mode. So when your extender is in mesh mode, you don't get as good a performance as if it was in access point mode and directly connected to your router with an Ethernet cable. But keep in mind, with mesh mode, your router and your extender are communicating wirelessly, so it's effectively functioning as a Wi-Fi extender, but you get much better performance because these two devices are in mesh mode. I won't get into the technical jargon here, but the reason why it's different is that in mesh mode, both of these devices, your router and your extender, they're communicating on a different channel, whereas a standard Wi-Fi extender will communicate with your router on the same channel that all of your devices are, and this is what contributes to the limited performance you get with a Wi-Fi extender. So with these new Wi-Fi extenders, it allows you to tailor your extender to how it best suits your home and the internet needs of your given situation. With this new information in mind, let's talk about when you should use a Wi-Fi access point and when you should use a Wi-Fi extender. So when it comes to Wi-Fi access points, you should implement them in scenarios where you know you need to extend a Wi-Fi signal and you don't have any power outlets nearby. A great use case here is if you need to extend your Wi-Fi signal outdoors. They make specific Wi-Fi access points that are made to be outside. Wireless access points can also be very handy if your home is already wired with Ethernet cables in the walls. This makes it much simpler to connect your access point and your router with an Ethernet cable. Otherwise, honestly, it can be a challenge because you don't want your Ethernet cable snaking all throughout your home in order to connect your access point and your router. Another use case for access points is if you're going for gold and you're having professionals install them in your home, especially if you're implementing multiple access points. They look really clean. They're not extremely noticeable. You can put them in the ceiling. They're low profile. They just look very professional if they're installed the right way and you have a home configuration that allows you to do that. This obviously applies if you're a technical or handy person and you're able to wire these Ethernet cables through your wall to your router. That way you can take advantage of the clean look of access points and you won't have any issues with people tripping over your Ethernet cables. When it comes to Wi-Fi extenders, you should implement these in pretty much any other use case, especially if you're unsure about which mode will best fit your home network, whether it be extender mode, access point mode, or mesh mode, or if you think your internet needs or your home configuration will change over time and you want a device that will change along with it. When it comes to Wi-Fi extenders, especially new ones, the only real limitation is the fact that they need to be connected to a power outlet. With all of the flexibility that they provide, chances are you'll be able to use it in a way that maximizes the Wi-Fi coverage and performance in your home. I'd love to see in the comments section what device you end up using to extend your Wi-Fi signal, whether it be an extender, an access point, or maybe it's some other device that you chose. And as always, thanks for checking out this episode from Network from Home, and we'll catch you on the next one.